Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hello, everyone. Just as something that's not even about this episode's topic today, I've just been noticing that when I've been recording these, I felt this sense of like, I need to do all these things before I start so that once I start, I can just go. Like I've been doing all this stretching before I record and wanting my body to feel just right and all of these things. And I realized it's because I've been kind of feeling like I said, like once I start recording, I have to just be ready and be on in this way that I never feel, for example, when I'm coaching. Like most of my clients can attest, the first thing I do when I got on a coaching call with them is I just take a really big breath. So I'm giving myself permission to take some big breaths with you, to let myself arrive with you all, I guess just a bit more authentically, so that I don't have to feel like I'm doing this big performance, that this can feel more like a conversation where, I'm sharing stuff that feels really authentic and true and hopefully really helpful to you. And also, of course, being really thoughtful about how I share my ideas in a way that's really respectful of your time. And also, I get to kind of be myself, and I get to take deep, big breaths as I need them. So anyway, I guess I'm just feeling called to kind of pull back the curtain and share what's coming up for me as I think about constructing this podcast. Like I said, I think in a previous episode, podcasts feel more intimate, and I just want to honor that in how I show up. As part of that, I also just want to say there's something funny that recording a podcast series, because obviously this is episode 2 of this podcast series about quote unquote my story. It brings up a lot of thoughts and fears for me. I felt after recording episode 1, which I did, or part 1, which I did yesterday, I thought, oh my gosh, Katie, you just went on too long about yourself. And then I was like, okay, number 1, this is literally your story. And number 2, people don't have to listen if they don't want to. You have lots of other content that's not your story. So I just want to name, it's so funny how, and I have managed my mind on this topic many times, and the fears are still there. So I don't know. Isn't that funny? Isn't it funny that we could still have those thoughts? I still like my reasons for doing this. And ultimately, as I explore my thoughts and decide what I really think, I think recording this is something I feel super aligned with, but the fears can still be there too. So I think that's so fascinating too. Okay. So to get to today's content, let's do it. So as I said, last episode, I kind of started telling my story, which is the story of how I became a coach, some of my biggest struggles as a person. And last time I shared one of my biggest breakthroughs, which was really around my eating. And I'm sure it's obvious, but if you haven't yet, I'd recommend listening to that one first, just because it'll give you some helpful context. And all of that kind of story takes us to my college graduation. So now I want to talk about what happened after that. So if we sort of backtrack, in the fall of my senior year, as I said, I interviewed for and got a job as a consultant at McKinsey, which is this big global management consulting firm. That job was to start after graduation. And this was a decision, working for McKinsey, that will probably make 1,000% sense to some of you and be very unfamiliar to others. The background to this is that at Princeton, like many other top colleges, on-campus recruiting for investment banks and consulting firms like McKinsey becomes this really huge thing. There is a certain amount of social prestige from having those jobs. It's very competitive, McKinsey especially. And so it becomes this thing that everybody kind of wants. Not everybody, but many people want. And if you remember, one of my core issues was just kind of knowing what I wanted at all, separate from what was kind of impressive. So from my end, I had had this sort of vague idea in college that I'd one day be a lawyer. My parents are lawyers, and I was a politics major in college, so I spent some time reading and writing about legal opinions, which I enjoyed, and I figured I'd like law school because I just liked school in general. But also, I think at the same time, some part of me still felt ill at ease with the lawyer path. Because I think I did know on some level that it was a big commitment. And I think some part of me felt like it kind of lacked this rightness. I didn't feel as confident as I wanted to feel in it. So working at McKinsey, getting that job there felt like a good way to kind of punt the law school or grad school decision while doing something that had a fair amount of social prestige and would look good on paper and all of that. I think that's probably sort of the way I was thinking about it at the time. So then I did graduate. I was in New York. I was in my early 20s. I was working as a management consultant at McKinsey, a job that's, like I said, ostensibly really good. And I use air quotes here. It's very quote unquote good on paper. It's impressive. It's supposed to lead to all these great things. And it just wasn't that great for me. And when I say that, I actually do want to give some more nuance there. I actually think, and I genuinely think that there's a lot to appreciate about those types of jobs. And there was a lot that I genuinely did appreciate at the time and still do about McKinsey. In particular, it's a place that's filled with really smart people. There's a big emphasis on your growth, and you learn just a huge amount. But also, and this was really hard for me to accept, and it took me a long time to accept, it also just wasn't a good fit for me. And to be fair here, as I've reflected on over the years, I actually wouldn't say that it was McKinsey per se that was the problem. I mean, yes, it was particularly long hours there, and the business travel associated with a management consultant type job is probably not a great fit for me. But honestly, it was more just that a typical office job was just not an amazing fit for me. I had really thrived under more of a student flexibility where I had a lot of control over what I worked on and how I worked best. And frankly, how I worked best was often alone in a quiet place with lots of opportunities for breaks. Like, my brain works best if I take a break to take a walk in the middle of the day. And that was just not this job. And I think it was also hard to accept that I didn't like this job because honestly, I didn't really know what I wanted to do instead. Most of the other jobs that I knew about also seemed to be office-y jobs, which, yes, might be shorter hours, might not involve as much travel, but they still involve sitting at a desk at a loud, and this is loud to me as an introvert, crowded office all day. And I will also say that in terms of the content of the job, like what you did all day, the other part of the problem was that there wasn't anything that I necessarily wanted to do instead. The work at McKinsey, it wasn't my greatest passion, but I did find it fairly intellectually interesting, and I did do decently well there. By the time I ended up leaving, which I'll talk about in a moment, I had gotten a promotion. I had gotten an offer to have them pay for grad school in return. So it was a fairly positive thing in terms of the feedback I got. But at the same time, before McKinsey, in my internships, I had worked for the government. I had worked for nonprofits. So I didn't think, oh yes, if I only worked for a nonprofit, if I only worked for government, if I only worked in some sort of different white collar job, for example, I'd be so much more passionate about jobs. I just kind of figured, oh, it seems like that's kind of just how I feel in all white collar jobs. Like, yeah, it's decently intellectually interesting, but also I'm totally exhausted sitting at a desk in an office all day. So I felt really stuck. Didn't feel great where I was, but also nothing else looked good either. And there wasn't anything I really wanted to do instead. And that's when the second big breakthrough came. About a year and a half into my time at McKinsey, my older brother, John, out of the blue, really, at least from my end, suggested I work with a coach. And that was which is my kind of breakthrough sound, because that's when the second big breakthrough came. My brother John was in business school at the time, and he told me he'd met this coach in business school, and he thought that I should work with her. And at the time, I kind of assumed that John knew that I was struggling with what I wanted to do next career-wise. So that's why he suggested I work with a coach. I really knew next to nothing about coaching, but somehow my brain had heard of a career coach. So I figured that was who the coach John suggested I work with. Her name was Allie. I assumed that's who she was, that she would read my resume, that she would make some suggestions about the next jobs I should apply to or something like that. And as a side note, I only discovered years later that that wasn't what had happened at all from John's end. Actually, John had seen me rereading some of Janine Roth's books at Christmas that year. And Janine Roth, as I mentioned in the previous episode, writes a lot about emotional and compulsive eating. And her books have titles like Breaking Free from Emotional Eating, which sound kind of intense and probably scary if you're just seeing your little sister reading these books and you don't know what's going on with her. And it's funny because at that point, I actually felt pretty great about my eating. I was just rereading those books for more insights to kind of deepen my connection with myself. And also, interestingly, I hadn't really talked to my family much about that eating journey. It was something that I kind of just did privately on my own. So I think that John was just kind of freaked out for me and he decided that this was how he could help me. And let's be clear, I would never have hired a coach on my own at the time. Partially, that's because I had literally never heard of anyone who worked with a coach, and I didn't know any coaches to hire. And I also had, as I said, no idea what coaching was. Like I said, I vaguely thought career coaching was a thing, but I really didn't know anything further than that. And even if I did know what coaching was and did know a coach, frankly, I know that I would have thought it was too expensive at the time. Because yes, I was at McKinsey, which is this kind of fancy place, and it does pay quite well in more senior roles. And it pays decently well for a just out of college job, but it's more like you can afford to share an apartment in Manhattan with 2 roommates and also contribute to your retirement fund. That's the kind of well-paying it was, which I mean is actually amazing for a 22 or 23 or 24-year-old, which is what I was at the time. It's great to be able to share an apartment in Manhattan with roommates, and it's great to be able to contribute to your retirement. But I wasn't making it rain with cash or anything. And it seemed pretty expensive to have a coach. And it feels really important to me to share that because I know a lot of people think the same thing about hiring coaches now. I know many of you think the same thing about hiring coaches. And I want you to know that I've totally been there. And John, and seriously, this is probably the most amazing thing that a sibling has ever done for another sibling. John was like, no, I really think you need a coach and I am going to pay for it. So John just made it absurdly easy for me to say yes. And I was facing down the barrel of not having any clue about what I wanted to do next. But I did know that McKinsey wasn't the right fit and that I would be leaving when my contract was over. So I kind of shrugged and I said, okay. So I started working with Allie, who was the coach who John had suggested for me. And I kind of had no idea what was going to happen. And I'll just cut to the chase because I've already told you how it goes. Coaching completely blew my mind. Like my transformation with eating, working with a coach was the second of what I consider to be 2 Pleasantville moments that I have had in my life. And to explain that reference, when I refer to a Pleasantville moment, have you ever seen that movie Pleasantville from the late 90s, I think? Without giving too much away, it's this black and white movie. It all happens in this kind of perfect 1950s black and white movie, small town, but then slowly for various reasons having to do with these kind of awakenings or transformations of the character, the movie slowly shifts to color for kind of each of those characters who are featured. And that's what changing my eating and working with Allie felt like. Both times it was like, suddenly I blinked and my world was in color. And it was the first time I realized it had been in black and white before. And I know that that sounds so dramatic, maybe overly dramatic, but it really did feel like that. And I think that's why I am so profoundly committed to personal growth, and that personal growth is possible for all of us. Because I have had these experiences of being like, oh shit, I'm a different person than I was. So I could spend just an hour on that coaching engagement and everything I learned from it. But here were two things that really profoundly changed for me. The first one was that I learned about somatic awareness. And I refer to somatic awareness in my newsletter, and I think I've already referenced it in this podcast so far, but just to explain the term, somatic refers to the body. So somatic awareness is just body awareness with a more fun word. And Allie, my coach, used kind of a variety of techniques to help me cultivate that awareness. But one of them was something called focusing. That's the word focusing, but with a capital F. So focusing, which is a practice that was pioneered by a guy named Eugene Gendlin at the University of Chicago. He was a professor, I think, there in the 70s. It's just very concrete methodology to become more aware of your physical or somatic sensations. Focusing folks would refer to those somatic sensations as a felt sense, which, as a side note, I just kind of love as a term, felt sense, because it's so evocative. Like you have a sense about something that you feel, a felt sense. And you use this felt sense to know more about how you feel about basically any element of your life. And also you can use it to make decisions or to know more about what you want to do next. So that's just to summarize focusing in this very, very brief way. And truly, when Allie introduced me to focusing and to being more in touch with my body, I was like, what is this? Like, it felt so foreign. It felt so strange. It felt like something that nobody had ever spoken to me about before. And also, it completely changed my life. Like, I realized I had all of these somatic reactions to literally everything in my life. And to be honest, it was kind of overwhelming at first. Like, I remember, because I was still working at McKinsey at the time, I was on a project for a division of the city of New York. And this department had offices that were fairly deep into Queens. And I was, as I said, living in Manhattan. And I just remember sitting on the subway. I was commuting from Chelsea in Manhattan, which is where I lived, to Queens. So it was a solid 45 minutes on the subway each way. And every day I would just feel my body, because I had finally learned that I had a body to feel. And the whole time I would be like, oh my goodness, there is so much here. Like, I didn't even want to read a book. I didn't want to listen to something on my, I guess I didn't have an iPhone at the time. I had a BlackBerry. I didn't want to listen to music. I was just like feeling my body on the subway. So that's the first thing I learned from Allie. I learned how to feel my body, and that this somatic awareness, this felt sense, contained an enormous amount of information about how I was feeling, about what I wanted, about what I yearned for, what I was resisting, and even more importantly, what I should do next. And even as I say this, I want to name that there's a real common thread between both my first Pleasantville moment around my eating and this one. Both of them had this element of being like, oh my God, there is way more here than I thought. There's rooms to this house that I never even knew existed. And if you've been around my world for a while, you've probably heard me say that a lot when I'm giving coaching advice or insights. I'll often say, there's more going on here than you realize. And that's because in my experience, there is always more to know about yourself than you currently know. And I am just, I would go to court to argue that point. Like 100% of my clients are missing something about themselves, something that could really help them with whatever challenge they're encountering. And I don't say that because like, oh, my clients are dumb or they're not self-aware or something. I just say that because that's the human condition. We're always missing something. There's always more to know. And I say that with so much confidence because I first learned that lesson in me. So I just want to take a breath to let that one land. Okay. So that is the first lesson, that I learned in my first experience with a coach: how to listen to my somatic awareness or my felt sense. The second thing I learned was that listening to myself could be a strategy for living. Listening to myself could be a strategy for living. And this was something that had really begun in my journey with food, as you heard about last time, because eating was this kind of first level warning signal about whether I was kind of listening to my deepest truth or not, because I would invariably eat too much if I was out of alignment with myself. And as I said in the previous episode, I had kind of started to use these insights about my eating and how it related to my life to shape my actions. I took more breaks. I thought in more complex ways about some of my relationships. But my work with Allie really just took that acorn of an insight, which I had come to on my own and honestly hadn't really talked to that many people about. And it kind of just, it felt like this weird private little skill I developed. And she kind of blew up that acorn into a full-blown oak with roots and fruit. And by the fruit, I guess the acorn is the fruit of the oak tree. Anyway, there were leaves. This oak tree was legit. Allie helped me realize that this problem that I had with making decisions, it was actually because I had been trying to pro-con list my way through my life. I had been trying to analyze my way through my life rather than listening to something deeper. And she helped me very concretely figure out how to listen. And remember, I was this super cognitive, super brain heavy person with all of my 16 years of schooling, which had been focused on this smart brain of mine. And it was crazy because it was like, oh my gosh, I don't have to analyze things. I can just know them. It was that kind of rightness, that kind of depth of knowing that I didn't even realize was available to me. And I will say, it may sound super blasé and easy when I say this, like, yes, I just figured out how to know things. But it was super, super not easy at the time. It felt very hard and scary. And frankly, I was pretty convinced that I was going to ruin my life if I moved through it this way. And we had a lot of conversations about my fears. So something that she really taught me as part of this whole thing, and this was so valuable to me as well, was that this thing that I had kind of stumbled upon on my own, this connection to my inner knowing that I had found through my eating, it wasn't just me, and it wasn't just available through eating. She helped me see through exposing me to other thinkers and through conversations with the two of us that what I was doing and trying to listen to my deepest self, it was very much the same as what people have been doing since the beginning of time, probably, but certainly since many of the major spiritual traditions were founded. I mean, I suddenly could see that within Buddhism or within Christian mysticism, so many writers and thinkers point to this idea that it's possible, and not just possible, but a really, really good idea to listen to something that is deep within you and that you could be led by this sense of rightness. And I was someone who, frankly, who had personally identified as an atheist. You know, ostensibly my mom's Jewish, my dad's Christian, didn't have a ton of religious education. And when I really started thinking about it, I self-identified as an atheist. But this whole experience turned me into a spiritual person because I could suddenly understand what spiritual people were talking about, listening to something that is both deep within you and bigger than you. And I think at the time, I just didn't necessarily know of other people who were moving through the world like this. I didn't know it was an option, that it was possible to have this deep sense of rightness about one's choices. I really thought that we had to use our smart brains to analyze things, to make decisions when that deadline came. Like that's the only responsible or okay way to decide things. So again, this was just this huge, huge shift for me. Even beginning to grok or to believe that I could just listen and be led, to use the words that Julia Cameron shares in The Artist's Way. Listen and be led became this real touch point phrase for me and really shifted things significantly. And I want to keep going with what happened from there. But before I do, I just want to say another serious kudos to my brother John here. And I have also told him this directly, but because of him basically finding me a coach and paying for it, he basically changed my life. And because I would not be the person I am today, I would not have married my husband, I would not be a coach myself, which is this extremely meaningful and satisfying career to me, if John had not been this, slightly pushy, but also extremely, astonishingly, remarkably generous older brother. And I will also say, maybe about 2 months into the coaching engagement, I was like, okay, this is worth every penny. I need to just bite the bullet and pay for it myself. So I did find room in my monthly budget and I paid for it. But I feel pretty confident I probably would not have started coaching where I was at the time mentally if John hadn't made it so freaking easy for me. And my life would have been the worse for it. So I just want to say that because maybe some of you out there have the financial means to help someone you care about in this way. And if you ever want to and choose to do it, my take is that that is just the most incredible gift you can give anyone, period. Okay, so in terms of the chronology of this story, at this point, I'm nearing the end of my 2-year contract with McKinsey, just as I'm also finishing up my work with Allie, my first coach. And it was funny because listening to myself more deeply meant that there were some things that I had started to know, like I said, in this different way than before. Like I knew them on a gut level. And another thing that I had started to really know on a gut level was what I truly didn't know and what was kind of unknowable for me at that moment in time. So to give an example, it was very clear to me that I wanted to leave my job at McKinsey. But simultaneously, it was also very clear to me that I didn't know what I wanted to do next. I had this kind of half-baked idea that I would help people who had struggled with their eating because that transformation had been so dramatic and positive for me, but I didn't really even know what that meant. Like, how is that a job? Is that a job? And to also be honest, this prestige-focused part of me was absolutely not dead. Most of the people I knew at McKinsey who left tended to do things like get fancy strategy jobs at Google or Facebook, which were probably sexier a decade ago or so, which is when I left, than they are now. And or if these people kind of quote unquote went off the beaten path, they went to Harvard Medical School. So they didn't quit McKinsey with no job and a vague ambition of helping people with their eating in not a particularly clear way. But I just kept feeling like I want to quit and I didn't know what I wanted to do next. And I really, in my core, wanted to give myself some time to rest and figure out what it was. So I quit. And I just remember what happened next as this very fruitful time for me, because I feel like that's the first time in my life where I actually just listened to what I most wanted and I tried to do it, whatever it was. And as part of that, one example is that I shaved my head, which is probably the most sort of outwardly clear example of that. I had wanted to shave my head for a couple years, but I had had these fears about doing it while at McKinsey. Actually, the first time I had wanted to shave it was the summer before I started at McKinsey. But again, I was too freaked out. My hair had also, while I worked at McKinsey, become this kind of fraught metaphorical thing for me. It had felt like this kind of physical manifestation of me being fake. Like I used to straighten it all the time. And because I had this whole mental story about, in order to be polished, in order to be respected, you had to have straight hair. And then it was kind of just burnt and fried from all of that processing, from all the straightening irons or whatever I used. And I just had this kind of gut desire to kind of cut it all off. And I think it was, to be fair, kind of like this metaphorical and also literal new start. So I did it at this little barbershop on 7th Avenue in Chelsea. And so that was a thing that I did during this time. I also ended a relationship with this, in fairness, really nice guy I was dating, who, in fairness to him, was also kind of frustrated with me because I was going through a lot after my work with a coach. And frankly, I was probably being kind of weird at the time. Like, I remember like I would be sitting at a restaurant with him and I'd be like, I just need a couple of moments to feel my body and connect with it, which, you know, I'm going to talk a bit more about what that's like to be in a relationship with me during that time later. But, you know, for a normal, typical person, that's a lot. So it just sort of wasn't the right fit. And on top of that, you know, separate from the relationship, separate from shaving the head, I was also realizing I was coming to know on a deeper level how profoundly tired I was and how profoundly tired I had probably been for many years. So I found myself just really trying to honor my desire to do things or not do things, depending on when I felt like. So that led to me doing some things that were kind of outside of the social norm, especially in terms of the social events that I chose to attend or not attend. I mean, to be totally frank, I was just not attending things a lot more often. And to be honest, I will say that this made some people mad. I was turning down invitations if I was tired and if I didn't want to go. And I had a close friend who told me that I was selfish for turning down an invitation from a mutual acquaintance of ours because I didn't actually have a quote reason. Like I didn't have another event to go to. I just didn't feel like going. I liked those people actually. I just happened to want quiet time by myself more that particular night. I had another friend at the time, also a close friend, who told me that I was an unsupportive friend at the time because I didn't attend some events that she wanted me to attend. And I have a third friend. Like I remember I chose not to go to a party of some mutual friends of ours and she just sort of looked at me and was like, what's going on with you? And I can relate these things calmly now, but hearing those things from friends, they felt like a complete stab through the heart at the time. It was like my deepest fear that someone would call me selfish. It happened. Even retelling it now, that friend who called me an unsupportive friend or when they called me selfish, like I can feel it in my body how much that affected me. It wasn't that I didn't mind that they said that. But also, even at the time, I felt really grounded in my choices in a way that I had never felt before. And so on a deeper level, I felt like, okay, you are upset with me and maybe you think I'm being weird, but also I have never liked my reasons more. And my reasons in my gut feel profoundly right to me. Like I said, in this way I've never really had before. So it was this period in my life where I felt really electric and alive for the first time. Like there was this incredible vividness I had never really felt before to each and every day. I felt like I was finally on this path that was right for me, even though I had no freaking clue where I was going. And for the first part of that period, I had like shaved my head and I was single and unemployed and I was like drawing a lot of pictures. It was very strange from the outside. And simultaneously, it was also a little isolating. Like I said, so many people I knew were sort of like, what's going on with you? You know, another example of this is my mom straight up said to me, Katie, if you are ever suicidal, please tell me. Like, I think the whole shaving my head thing had really freaked her out. It felt very surprising and sudden. And when she said that to me, I said to her, no, I actually feel way happier than I'd ever been. So that was true. Also, it was this strange, kind of scary and weird and exciting and slightly isolating time for me because it didn't feel like most people were trying to navigate their lives in the way that I was trying to navigate life. So I just want to share that piece of my story for two reasons. The first one is that I've seen seasons like this in many of my clients too. Like sometimes they get better at listening to their own authenticity, and there can be a period of kind of more intense aliveness and blossoming and growth. Not to be too dramatic about it, but it kind of can feel that way. But also sometimes along with that, there can be a way in which it feels a little isolating because sometimes it can feel like the people around you are like, what's going on with you? Or they're kind of not moving through the world in that way. And I will say, from the perspective of 10 plus years later, the distance between me and other people just feels so much less now. I think it was just the period of kind of learning those new skills when it all felt so new and so weird. And I was kind of like this Bambi on shaky legs that I kind of found it hard to relate to other people who weren't really in those same questions. But over time, I found that I could relate to all kinds of people again, and I felt far less distant from them. And in watching my clients, again, I just want to say that experience of isolation, if they have it, and the second thing I want to say about this is really not everyone has it at all. Like, you can also just become more authentic, know what you want, and not experience that. But if you do, the experience of isolation almost always lessens over time. So I wanted to make sure I shared those kind of caveats. So this season of my life, it was like about 6 months after I left McKinsey. I had shaved my head. In this period of my life, I often sort of remember time passing based on how long my hair was as I was growing it out. So at this time in my life, it was 6 months after I left McKinsey, I had a pixie cut and I met my future husband, Gil. Gil and I met online. We'd been dating, or I had been dating online for the first time ever. I had been online for like a month and I had gone on a couple of terrible dates and I was about to delete my membership on this site. And then I got a message from this guy, basically. Well, actually, the longer version of the story is I had let my membership expire, so I couldn't read messages, but I could see that I had gotten messages. So I was online sort of looking at profiles. I saw that I had gotten a message. It wasn't even from Gil, but I think because I was online at that time, Gil saw my profile and he messaged me, and then I renewed my membership to view his message. So really almost missing each other in a kind of amazing way. But Gil and I, on that online dating platform, I think we exchanged like 4 messages. And then in his very typical way, he was like, well, if you ever want to chat, call me. Here's my number. I had like 15 minutes before I was going to go to my roommate's choir concert. So I did. And again, this first conversation I had with him is, again, one of those vivid life moments, because I remember that we basically just exchanged hellos. And then he was like, okay, so what's important to you in life? Like, he didn't say, what do you like to do on weekends or what do you do for a living? He was just straight to like, what's important to you in life? And I actually alluded to this interaction, this first call with him, in that Q&A that Gil and I did on dating, which I recently released. But I don't think I shared what happened next because, he asked me what matters to you in life right out of the gate. And I remember just sort of stuttering and feeling awkward and being like, then I sort of mumbled something about, I didn't know for sure what I wanted, but I knew what I didn't want. I knew that I didn't want to feel like I was pushing my way through life. I didn't want to feel like I was denying what I knew I really needed. So that was my answer for him. And then he told me whatever he told me. I can't even remember what it was. And I was like, oh my gosh, this guy gets straight to it. He's very intense, but he's also a really deep person. And then the 15 minutes were up and I had to hang up and go to my roommate's choir concert. And he was kind of like, well, if you ever want to chat again, call me. And to be honest, I kind of thought I might never talk to him again. Like, I hilariously, in retrospect, had this conversation with my roommate that night after her concert where she was like, I don't know, Katie, he doesn't sound that fun and you're pretty fun. I mean, I will say in retrospect, this roommate is still a friend and she loves Gil. But it's just funny that was her initial impression based on what I said. But a few days later, as I said, I was going through this period where I was feeling kind of alone and lonely. And I thought to myself, I don't know if I'm going to date him, but it could be nice to talk to that kind of deep guy. So I called him. And on that second call, he was just so much more balanced, such a fuller person. He was still very, very deep, but he was also funny and thoughtful and much warmer. And it came out that when he's nervous, he kind of gets intense versus I think when I'm nervous, I kind of make jokes and I that's kind of my way of dealing with it. So a lot of also what was happening on that first call, I think, which is he was nervous, which is understandable. But I just share that whole exchange because I think that it tells you a really important thing about Gil. And it might just seem like I'm telling this romantic story when I said that I was going to tell the story of my sort of personal growth moments and why I became a coach. But my relationship with Gil ended up being kind of maybe my third big life transformation because I had never met anyone like Gil. He was authentic and deeply committed to his own truth in a way that I had never encountered anyone being close up. And as I said, I was feeling kind of isolated at that time in my own journey. And Gil in particular seemed to completely understand what was going on for me. He was like, yeah, you never listened to yourself before. And now you are. You should keep doing that. And remember how I said that sometimes I would like sit in a restaurant and say to my old boyfriend who I'd broken up with, I would say, can I just take a couple of moments to feel my body? Because like there was so much going on for me there and I was just learning how to listen to it. And suddenly it would feel like I was kind of overwhelmed and I needed to listen to it. And my old boyfriend was sort of like, oh my gosh, you are being very weird. I would do that with Gil. I would ask if it was okay if I felt my body and he'd be like, yeah, sure. And so we would sit at it was like Bear Burger in Park Slope. I remember this happening a lot there. And I don't know if Bear Burger is even still there. And I would just like close my eyes, like feel my body for a couple of moments, which hilariously, like I don't even do now anymore really because I just don't need to, but I really needed to at the time. It was just like there was so much happening. I needed to process it. My whole body sensations were very overwhelming to me. But Gil was totally chill about the whole thing, which again was this sign to me that he totally got it. He wasn't embarrassed by me. He totally knew what I was going through. He appreciated that I was trying to stay in touch with myself. And as part of that authenticity, Gil was really good at two very specific things that I was still struggling with. One of those was that he had basically always understood his own introversion and his own energy needs. And he had basically always followed them. So he was this person in my life who would say like, okay, why are you going to this party? Aren't you going to be exhausted? And why don't you just not do this? Because as much as, I said I was readjusting my life better to suit my energy needs, and I was saying no to a lot of things, there was even still a lot that I was doing that I would have just preferred not to do because I felt guilty and because I felt like I should and because I felt like, oh, I need to, or these people will be upset. And just knowing that there was another person who knew his truth and really followed it in all ways, but especially in terms of his energy, it was this game changer for me. And I will say the other thing that Gil is just really, really good at is that he does not care about prestige. Like he was kind of like, okay, who cares about Harvard Medical School? Whatever. Gil comes from this very different background from me in every sense. He came here from Portugal when he was 10. Both of his parents had very limited education. He didn't end up finishing college till he was, I think, 31 or sometime around there. So he was just very dismissive of my very strong preference for impressiveness. And that was also, frankly, really helpful for me to have someone very close to me who just did not get sucked into the whole thing. Because it felt like, and this is sort of high level, a lot of the time back then, there were moments, many moments, when he saw me more clearly than I saw myself, which, is also a thing that I had felt in working with Allie, my coach. But, I will say knowing yourself and acting on what you know in the world, it's a process. I made enormous strides with Allie, but I still struggled sometimes to know what I wanted, and this was really more often, I felt afraid to follow what was true because I still had all of these thoughts that were getting in my own way. And having someone in my life, someone who really cared about me and saw me so clearly, who would call me out when I was bullshitting myself, that was such a profound experience. Okay, so at this point, if you're following the story chronologically, we're maybe like a year after me leaving McKinsey. I'm in my mid-20s. I'm dating Gil. I've picked up part-time work at this point. One of my big fears in leaving my McKinsey job was that I would just never, ever want to work again. Like that was really something I was very afraid of. But it turned out that eventually, just like I had a very authentic desire to rest, I had an authentic desire to get some income coming in through the door to not burn through my whole savings. So I initially started working at this very high-end SAT and sort of general standardized tests and school tutoring agency. This was an agency where, as of 8 years ago, tutors charged as much as $1,000 an hour. I didn't charge that much, but that was the kind of place it was, which is a place which probably only exists in very specific cities and very specific circles. So I started working there, and after that, I started working at this ed tech startup. And honestly, I was still kind of floundering in terms of career direction because in my heart, I really wanted to start helping people who were struggling with their eating. That was still this transformation that had totally changed my life, and I felt like I could help other people, but I still felt afraid and I still felt unqualified. And it's funny, my coach, Allie, before we had finished, she'd urged me to start coaching because I had told her I had this interest. And as a side note, coaching is this funny industry. You actually don't need any formal training or accreditation to start coaching. I do have all of those things now. I have certification and I have accreditation with the sort of only independent licensing organization for coaches. And Allie also had those things, but anyone technically can just put up a shingle and start coaching. And so she had suggested that I should just try it out before getting any training to see if I liked it. And I was still kind of scared to do that, but I also really wanted to. I'd actually, and this is always a sign that you actually want to, I'd even bought this kind of online course that was about how to start a business online. And I was stalking other people online who were coaches, especially around eating, but I was really scared to actually start it. But ultimately, what got me to start coaching was that this is genuinely hilarious, but I share it to be really authentic with you about my story and my journey and my struggles. What actually got me to start coaching was that I still sort of thought in the back of my mind that I was going to go back to school and get an MBA one day. I mean, to be clear, I did not want an MBA. I just figured that I would eventually need to be quote unquote practical. I'd need to get a real job. And so I should start to think about I was going to put on my MBA application when the time came. And honestly, I thought it would probably sound good on my application if I'd done some coaching on eating issues. Like it would show this kind of quirky side of me or something. So that's what got me started. I made a website, I started a newsletter, I started taking on some clients, and things grew very slowly over the years from there. About a year in, I trained at New Ventures West, which is sort of one of the older coaching schools in the profession, which is where my coach had trained. And I got accredited with the ICF, which the International Coach Federation, which is kind of the only, like I said, independent professional licensing organization for coaches. And once I actually got started coaching, it quickly became clear to me that I was never going to get an MBA. Like, why was I going to do that if I liked coaching so much? And at first, like I said, I only did coaching for people who struggled with their eating like I had. I did one-on-one coaching and I ran groups who were called dessert clubs or the dessert club. And as I was starting my coaching business, and I also kind of had some other jobs on the side, I would also say that the big overarching theme of my life at the time was that I was just trying to still really listen to myself profoundly. And the message that was basically screaming at me over and over during this time was, go slow and please rest. It felt like there was this really deep sense of, do not rush the launch of this business. Don't rush into doing too much. Like, take this slow. And again, if you're me, I'm watching all these people I know from Princeton and McKinsey do these very impressive young adult job things. And I have this kind of teensy tiny coaching business, which kind of seems like at the time to me, like it might never be much of anything. And honestly, the whole thing was pretty hard on my ego, which still totally existed. That ego had not died. But also, I could not argue with my gut. I knew that I had finally, after so much personal work, found this sense of rightness. And if I lost it, I just had this deep sense that if I lost it, I had no navigational compass at all. My sense of rightness was like my sense of traction on the ground. And if I lost that, I'd just be sliding and skidding. So I had this really deep sense that I had to stay in touch with that. So I slowed down. I rested a lot. And I let myself really make decisions about my time and my career in a way that felt really slow and iterative and gradual. And this funny kind of maybe cosmic irony, a lot of what allowed me to rest so much was that I actually got a great part-time job back at McKinsey, which paid me well enough to live. I mean, and I didn't have to work a huge number of hours. So I had a lot of time to rest and putter and just be and let my coaching practice grow slowly. And when I say that I made enough money to live, I mean, let's be clear, I live simply. And when I was in 27, Gil and I moved from New York to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which lowered my expenses to being very, very low. So I wasn't going to like charter a private jet to the Maldives, but I had enough money to be able to rest a lot and live, which was a big deal. But it's funny to me, I say it has cosmic irony because all of that work I did in college and my first job, that was what allowed me to have this incredible part-time job and grow my coaching practice in a way that felt really right for me. So I feel really grateful to past Katie for all that she did and the way in which she really supported me and in some ways gave me the gift of this time to really rest and listen and be led by that. And throughout, my coaching always felt like this really profoundly right thing for me. It was this one thing that once I started doing, I never really wavered on. Like I just love coaching and I loved it more, the more skillful I got. And eventually, because as I said, I just started doing eating coaching, eventually I realized that truly like 90% of what I was talking about with those eating coaching clients was basically their lives as a whole, more generally, because your reasons for eating when you aren't hungry, they're fundamentally about your whole life, like I said, in terms of my own revelation. So getting all that sorted out, it's tricky. And it's really the meat of the eating coaching work. So I was like, I could just do regular life coaching. Like it's basically what I'm doing anyway. So I started taking on clients who didn't have eating issues at all. And there was a while where I kind of did both. Like I was doing eating coaching and I was doing general life coaching. And then a few years ago, I just realized that at this point in my life, what lit me up the most was my life coaching practice. So I really shifted my work to do only that. So that's where we are. Here, now, in the present day, I am a life coach. I'm married to that Gil guy. I live back in LA, which is where I grew up. I have 2 kids, and I really love being a coach. I just felt like I needed to take a breath with that one. I feel very grateful that my life took me here because my job and my partner and a lot of elements just have that deep sense of rightness for me in my belly. And it's funny because, sometimes in conversation, or maybe it's just me, you'll play that game, which is like, what other jobs would you have if you could have any job? And I'm always like, I don't know. I really love being a life coach. And okay, I will give one other caveat there, which is to say, I sometimes do say in that game that I want to be a matchmaker because I love relationships. And I think I just say matchmaker because ultimately I just want to coach my clients on their dating. And then as soon as I say that, I realize that if I actually coach people only on their dating, I would just become a life coach again, because if I coach you on your dating life, we're going to get into everything, your career, your emotions, your sense of meaning, because everything's related. And then again, I am back to being a life coach. So there you have it. That's my story. That's why I became a coach. And I will say in my story, there are so many themes that show up a lot in my coaching work. Struggling to know what we actually want, the struggle to separate what we want from what's impressive, and separating what we want from what, quote unquote, makes sense to our logical brain. There is a big theme in my coaching work with my clients of noticing how our compulsions, my first big one was my eating, but technology was also a big one for me, noticing how our compulsions are telling us things about our lives. And of course, there's a big theme in my work of figuring out how to have enough energy and feel good in our lives. And, forgive me for saying something that maybe is super obvious, but a big part of why those are themes in my work and why I'm really good at coaching on them is because I have lived them. I often say that one of the things that has made me skillful as a coach is that I have done my work. I have struggled with so many things, more than I even mentioned here. And I've done just an enormous amount of self-inquiry and self-observation and worked with many coaches myself, more obviously than I've mentioned here. I have been in the muck and the swamp of myself. And I hope that what I have found resonates with you, and I hope it's helpful to you. I'm just taking my breaths today, team. So as we close out, I will say that I hope this was helpful, either to get to know me better, and I particularly hope that there's themes in my story that are helpful to you too. And as always, I'm rooting for you in the week ahead. You've got this. If you really want to change, in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.